So would you friend Edward Snowden on Facebook? And do you think your employer has a right to know that? So why does a discussion of ethics belong in a computer technology course? It's because technology is changing our capabilities, and that's forcing us to look at our values, to look at our morals, and determine whether or not they make sense with what we're now capable of. And this can be a really hard discussion because not all of us get our values from the same place. Some of us get our values from a religious system, which means that we don't really choose our values as much as we inherit them from a text or from the teaching of elders. But I guess it is true that you get to pick your religion, so even with that you have some level of choice. For some of us, our values come from our family or society, and we choose whether or not to adopt them based on our sense of obligation to society and whether or not we feel that it satisfies our moral duty to those around us. Some may think that our morals are entirely internal and that we achieve a moral state by sort of being true to the best versions of ourselves. Others of us might simply look at the outcomes of the behavior and determine whether or not a particular behavior is moral based on a utilitarian analysis of the outcomes for both ourselves and for others. And it was the MIT professor Sherry Turkle who said in the documentary Digital Nation that technology challenges us to assert our human values. But in order to do that, we first have to figure out what they are. And you're making decisions based on your values every day. Simple decisions like, should I post this embarrassing picture of my friend on Instagram? Should I put in a fake email address so that I can use this free service online? Should I lie about my age so that I can visit a website that's clearly for people that are 21 or over? And there are so many bigger moral questions that don't have clear-cut answers. I mean, think about the example of Julian Assange and his website WikiLeaks, which publishes online information from whistleblowers. A lot of information that is sensitive government information, secrets that our government would rather keep to themselves. And the revelations from Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower, who, despite the fact that the government said that they weren't monitoring its citizens, said, actually we are, and this is how we're doing it, and this is something that you should be afraid of. Now, for some people, these two men are traitors. They're terrible villains, right, that need to be stopped, that they're hurting Americans, and they're hurting people that are meaning to do good. And for others, they're heroes. They're people that are sort of fighting the establishment to make sure that, government is truthful and honest and transparent to its citizens. And these questions are not easy to answer. I mean, is it right to reveal the truth, to blow the whistle about something your government is doing that you think is wrong, something that you think the public should know about? Even if by revealing that truth, you end up jeopardizing the mission of our diplomats and our military overseas, even if it might possibly lead to retaliation that could cost the lives of American troops? Now, big questions like that are important, and our answers to those as a society, as a group, are going to shape public policy in the future. But there's lots of other questions that you sort of have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that determine your behavior. I mean, consider the question of, is it right to download movies and music illegally from the internet? The fact is, it's illegal. But at the same time, not very many people get caught doing it. And so chances are you could probably get away with it. And so the question becomes, do you think it's right or do you think it's wrong? And if that's the case, how will that actually shape your behavior? It's entirely possible you might think it's wrong and choose to do it anyway. So what does that say about you? What does that say about your ethics? I mean, we know what you gain from downloading music illegally. You save $10 for every album that you download for free. But that money comes from somewhere. And so some people will say, well, musical artists are rich, and therefore it doesn't matter if I take $10 away from them. But does that mean that it's somehow more wrong to steal from an artist like Lupe Fiasco than to steal from an artist like Justin Timberlake simply because he sells more albums? Some people say, well, but the artists don't get very much of the money anyway, and so therefore I'm really just stealing from some faceless corporation. I'm not actually stealing from the artists that I love. But at the same time, there are people who work for those companies that do a lot of stuff in order to make that album happen. Is it right to take that money from them just because you don't want to pay for it? The point is that 20 years ago, these questions would never even have been asked. To steal an album, you would have actually had to pocket it at a music store and somehow sneak it out the front door. Almost everybody feels that that is stealing, right? Because you're stealing a physical object. But digital objects, they don't seem to have the same value. People don't view it as stealing, even though from a monetary standpoint, it really is. And so we have this situation where, in the late 90s, when people were beginning to share music, it didn't impact much because there weren't very many people doing it. But as it became more and more popular, it's actually made a huge change to the record industry. It's changed the way that artists make money. It's changed the type of artists that actually get to make albums. It's affected a lot of things and completely changed an industry that a lot of people loved. And there are lots of little decisions like that. I tend to watch my television using a DVR, a digital video recorder, so that I can skip commercials. It seems like an easy thing to do, and I have the technology to allow me to do it. But by skipping commercials, I've actually taken away the source of revenue that television stations had for producing that content. And so now television stations are more and more often choosing to either produce reality television, which is very cheap to make, or to sort of supplement the actual commercial income from a show by actually putting commercials into the show, by making our sort of favorite characters in a show maybe use an Apple device and talk about how great the iPad is right in the middle of a show for no apparent reason, right? Television has had to make changes due to the technology that was created by the DVR and the fact that I just found it more convenient to not watch commercials. And some issues are both personal and sort of practical on a day-to-day basis, and yet at the same time sort of large ethical issues, like the issue of privacy. Some people believe that when you use technology online, you should have an expectation of privacy, and that privacy should be protected by law. But others say that that only frustrates businesses that want to come up with creative, new, innovative products that they could give you for free simply by taking your information. And that if you don't like the information you're giving to a company, that you could simply not use that service. You could go with a different service if one exists. And these issues of privacy extend to the government. You may have heard the argument that government monitoring is not a big deal because the only people that should be afraid of government monitoring are people who have something to hide, and that government monitoring its citizens digitally can actually help prevent terrorist attacks. But does that make it okay for the government to potentially snoop and read your email or violate your privacy in some other way? There are good, intelligent, well-meaning people on both sides of that argument. And what about employers? Is it right for an employer to ask for your username and password to look up your social media profiles on Facebook or Twitter? Is it right for them to search those accounts out without actually asking your permission in order to do research to determine whether or not you'd be a good employee? I mean, do you have an expectation of privacy for your social media accounts? Or is it a public thing, and because you put it out on the internet, then yeah, anybody can judge you based on what you put online? And is it okay for companies that offer free web services like Facebook or Google to monitor your web usage, to look at all the different sites you visit, even when you're not actually using one of their sites directly, simply because you're logged into their systems and they choose to monitor all of your behavior and share that information with advertisers? You do know that's how those companies make their money, right? It's not like they didn't tell you about it. They were completely upfront. You probably just clicked I agree and moved on. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that business model. When you think about it, that's the business model that television has had for decades, right? You get free entertainment in exchange for them selling access to you to advertisers. The only difference is that the technology has now allowed those advertisements to get really, really specific. I mean, I have to admit, it feels a little creepy that they know that I wanted the Hornby Flying Scotsman model train set. Even my wife didn't know that I wanted that. And this may be an area where we can actually see our values as a society changing from one generation to the next. The Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism at USC did a study where they asked people from different generations, millennials, Generation X, and baby boomers about their thoughts on technology and privacy. When asked whether or not they agreed with the statement that no one should ever be allowed to have my personal data or web behavior, 70% of millennials said, no, I agree with that statement. People should not be allowed. But that's actually down 7% from what Generation X and baby boomers said. But what's even more telling is that millennials were far more likely to give up their privacy and exchange personal information for some sort of benefit. 51% of millennials said that they would give up personal information in order to receive some benefit online, with even 56% of millennials saying that they would give up their physical GPS location in order to just receive a coupon or some sort of deal. Now, there are a couple different ways we can interpret this. We could say that millennials are simply more aware that their personal information has value to other people, and so they're more willing to sort of exchange that personal information in order to receive some value back. For some people, they may just say that the millennials have sort of a differing opinion on privacy, right? They think of privacy differently. I mean, if 56% of millennials would be willing to give away their personal information in order to receive a coupon, well then certainly they would probably be willing to give away their personal information to help prevent terrorism. And yet, if there's anything we've learned about the millennial generation, it's that they won't fit into the neatly constructed boxes that baby boomers and Generation X have created. And so it's hard to say that millennials don't really value privacy. I mean, Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower, was or is a millennial, right? And a recent Pew study showed that 57% of millennials believe that he acted in the public interest, that he's a hero. This is the exact opposite of the result given by baby boomers, who do not view Edward Snowden with quite the same level of admiration. Clearly, our values are changing, but how and why, those are topics that still remain to be discussed. And like a lot of discussions about things in our society, we often find that our voice comes from artists, people who are creating television shows and movies and music that are now exploring these sort of ethical technology ideas. I mean, there's a television series that's been put out called Selfie that sort of looks lightly at some of the sort of interpersonal communication of people who are sort of addicted to social media. Now, that show may or may not be canceled by the time you actually see this, but it's an attempt to sort of look at what does this technology do to us and what does it mean for us and how should we go about using it. Jason Reitman has a movie coming out called Men, Women, and Children, which may actually already be out by the time you see this, right? That explores some of the ideas of privacy and how much sort of control should we try to exhibit over our children when it comes to things like social media. People are beginning to have these discussions, and we're beginning to work them out as a society, right? In discussions that we have with our friends, in discussions that we have with our families around the holidays, we're beginning to sort of ask, we can do all of these things with technology, but what should we do? And artists will probably continue to ask those questions of us as a society, at least if piracy doesn't put them completely out of business. And I suppose it makes sense that in a world that seems to be getting more and more complicated, that our morals and our ethics would also become more complicated as a result. With great power comes great responsibility, and with great capabilities comes a lot of questions about whether or not we should be doing what we're capable of.